Hello everyone, today we talk about the Christianization of Europe. Right, this is a big topic that we address today, actually from not the usual manualistic perspective that we dealt with it already. We arrived at 60 videos in the medieval Christianity playlist, which is a lot, right? And sometimes you gotta stop and say, okay, why are we talking about this, and what is it we can say about such a big chapter, and why is it addressed so much on Schwerpunkt, but also why does it arise? Kind of, I wouldn't say problems or controversies necessarily, but debate in general, even in a positive sense, in popular culture, in the world we live in. Well, in the videos we already made on medieval Christianity, I think we have addressed fundamentally this topic. We have observed how essentially the construction of the church was essentially the answer to certain needs and demands of the local populations, both from a spiritual point of view, but also, and very importantly, from an administrative point of view, during the phase of decline of the empire, especially in the west, but also in the east, where it definitely contributed to back instead the solid monarchy, Roman monarchy of Constantinople and its empire. And but there is more. We have also observed monastic history. We have actually not dealt much with full monasticism in the High Middle Ages, but we will get to that more. We have surely discussed it, but we have concentrated, in fact, on the first spread of monasticism. Also in here, essentially another path of Christians that decided not to participate to the saeculum in a deep sense. I mean, in the idea that essentially human society is inherently corrupt, it's obviously sinful, and there's not much that can be done at the base of it, because of course you can't erase original sin, but you can, however, make things better on earth during our time on earth by essentially emulating Christ and his lifestyle, and this path of isolation, of hermetism, which is not entirely exclusively the Christian one. Jesus is also a kind of a public figure in the sense, and that's also what is important to remember about monasticism since its beginnings, and also with its particular Western character. It was somewhat different from the original one in Egypt and Syria, and how it developed in other areas. The connections between the monastery and the rest of the world that had to be aware of what monks were doing, because otherwise they could have not emulated their lifestyle. And there was also contrast naturally between the ecclesiastical hierarchies and monasticism, because there were essentially two different worlds with two different worldviews in terms of how Christianity had to deal with reality, with the problems that were naturally, they were complementary at some point too, but they still were somehow two different choices, choices of lifestyle more than else. Monasticism, as you know, was also kind of more heterodox by default. We can say, monasticism often contained the most radical and the also, kind of, ascetic and instances of purification, etc. It's obvious that the ecclesiastical hierarchy participated more to the saeculum, as involved more directly in political matters, in also military ones, etc. So this doesn't quite explain, why did Christianity spread, why it had reached to that point. Okay, we know it kind of started fulfilling certain roles that up to that point had been essentially a matter of state that also, for what concerns the Roman Empire, they were never quite fully public, to be honest. Like, we think as the Roman Empire very often like a sound state where the administration controlled everything and it was all centralized. No, it wasn't quite like that. Actually, most of the empire was ruled by private people, right? They who obtained, of course, a public endorsement and recognition and titles, and that but it was the only way you could rule in that sense. So today we won't be we will not explain why did Christianity affirm itself, because it's an enormous topic, telling the truth, but at least point out why it responded in part to the needs, in great part actually to the needs of the populations in Europe, and in areas, by the way, that had not been part of the empire. The early medieval times see the spread of Christianity beyond what the Roman borders had been, and also this is a great cultural journey, a great path of civilization. In my view, I don't consider it as necessarily as a positive or negative thing as such, right? This is also another very big topic to address, because you can interpret, of course, you can address both interpretations. From one side, you can see Christianity as essentially a civilizing tool, whether you want to even if you want to conceive it as a civilization as such, because it's debatable how much pre-existed Christianity in regards of certain aspects. So it's obvious that Christianity as a religion owes much to other civilizations as well, and to other philosophies, and to other thoughts, but it also has a peculiar totalizing meaning that I believe had a great importance, and also in a sense of in a moral, in culture and spiritual sense altogether. Also from an educational point of view, the relation with science, that as far as we are concerned, we often hear, the Middle Ages were so dark because the church oppressed people and didn't let them study. No, the major scientific accomplishments of the Middle Ages were pioneered by the church, right? And also in a kind of universalistic direction, not like an exoteric tendency. And actually, I must say, this is not true also just for Christianity. This is something you can see also in Judaism and in Islam, where you realize that objectively orthodoxy as such, while there is always an heterodoxy at some point, has a broad kind of rationalistic, pragmatic, scientific approach to certain issues, because they have effectively to rule over what were conceived as ecumenic empires, right? The other interpretation you can give of Christianity in this, and there would be a lot to talk about. Of course, today we stop fundamentally to the 10th century. I mean, we'll actually stop at the early Middle Ages as such. Another interpretation you can't. So, excuse me. What I meant is that, of course, we won't be talking today about scholastics, or so the moment of major and most evident scientific accomplishment of Christian theology as such. But going back to the second interpretation of Christianization of Europe, instead there is a kind of a more harsher view of the story, and this views actually cannot be disjointed, right? Jonathan Schwerpunkt can always kind of I don't really pick just the best of things I discuss. Like if I discuss the history of civilization or culture or people, normally I say like that generally speaking the world sucked and still sucks in many ways, but at least when we suck, because objectively we do as humans, as we can do some of the most twisted and wicked and horrible things at the same time, which is pretty homogeneous in certain regards. At the same time, highlighting the good stuff and saying, part of the reason if things have improved in absolute terms, well, we owe it also to people who came before. And we are not very prone to recognize this, especially when we go back to the Middle Ages, that very often is considered like a hub of obscurantism and nothing else. Of course, nobody who has gained a university education on medieval history can even think to take a degree by owning such an opinion, because it's basically, I think nobody is really addressing history anymore in these terms. I mean, some people do, but they do it in other classes, like, I don't know, that have a much more marked political orientation, and that express extremely superficial judgments about such topics. Consider that, being an expert, like if you're a PhD in something, you're really not. First of all, you're not even qualified necessarily on most things that pertain your subject, right? Being, especially today, getting a certain level of education entails, of course, knowing a lot of things, but still remaining confined in a certain field, a certain spectrum, because objectively there is always more to know. So this is a natural consequence, but this doesn't mean, therefore, that, I don't know, if you are a PhD in physics, actually all physics well. Like, you most likely don't. There are many fields, and especially applied physics, etc., like with any other thing, like with medicine and engineering, that you don't know, right? And the less, of course, you can know and understand about other subjects that do not pertain to you. So you can see actually a lot of people, among scientists, journalists, also people who have, for example, a humanistic education, some of the most superficial and idiotic statements about the Middle Ages and the history of, medieval philosophy and Christianity, as well as Islam, as well as, the broader religious sphere, right? And this is always a warning to say, do not think that a person who has just a good education is necessarily competent about everything in the first place. I think I prove this every day, because I talk about so many different topics, and you realize that I'm not an expert about all of them, but not even, a little part of it. So I actually tell you, I don't know about this, for example, or there is this problem, but I don't own the specific competence for discussing this. Even today's topic would require actually a person who is specialized in, in many things that I'm not. Mostly meaning, maybe a historian of religion or things. But even though this topic embraces much broader spectrum, because it's really a macro topic, and it's a series of different topics altogether. And but I think that still we can make sense of something by realizing that we can't go on by considering the history of religions as an unnecessary thing, or as something that is necessarily ideologized or propagandistic, right? History of religions is fundamentally basilar for every single humanistic study. Like, what do you study the history of Western civilization if you don't study Christian theology? It's impossible. How can you understand Shakespeare if you don't know theology? How can you... there is such an enormous field of studies also concerning this. How can you study? Throwing in random examples, scholastics is probably the greatest, but iconoclasm in the Byzantine Empire. How can you study, even pretending of understanding what it is, iconoclasm, if you don't study Christian theology? It literally doesn't make sense by any standard, right? So studying this history is not studying the history of a niche, of a team, of a sect, of something you're free to disagree or agree with. This is simply realizing that religion permeated the whole world at the time, and especially that whichever religion you're talking about doesn't make exceptions. There is also a very Western-centric attitude sometimes to certain positions, that is essentially that as Westerners we talk about religion, we criticize religion just, for example, for what concerns Christianity, right? And that tells us, these people should be asked, have you ever conceived the fact that, I don't know, monotheism as well as other religions were all around, and that people at the time all owned certain beliefs, and that certain were actually way more developed as very well structured and complicated philosophical systems, like monotheisms in particular, but also the others being extremely complex. We talked a lot about paganism and Schwerpunkt, even what concerns, for example, military aspects, right? There was a person the other day that appreciated very much, for example, that video I made on the Gaelic warrior of the ancient world, because he pointed out that I had explained a perspective that he was very impressed by. That was in fact the spiritual one of the Fiannas, for example, these military bands in the in the Irish, in the Gaelic world. And that made sense for these people more than anything else. And you have to give an answer. You can't say, well, this is where, because people were stupid or were ignorant. Well, ignorant about what, right? If you live in a world where you don't have the actual means to arrive to a point, you can sort out essentially what modern physics is, and you have to cope with the world you live in. What do you think that these solutions, these philosophical systems, these beliefs are fundamentally useless? Because now we know, I don't know, that certain things that were believed at the time are not believed anymore. Aside from the fact that messages like the monotheistic ones, but also the pagan ones, in large part, are fundamentally congruent with a certain vision of the world that can be still largely shared today. Because they are really philosophies. It doesn't even depend whether we're talking about theism or not. This is really about realizing that what people believed at the time was functional to that world. These people weren't doing things that were inherently wrong for their world. We can't say that it was right either. This is maybe poorly posed as a perspective, but let's say that societies tend to hold beliefs that essentially reflect what their horizons are necessarily about. Necessarily not meant deterministically speaking, but it's obvious that if I have a certain understanding of the world, I will reason accordingly. Right? What did these people know about, I don't know, the solar system as such? They knew something about astronomy. They mixed it with astrology. They believed in many other things, but they had a completely different vision, dimension, depth of an understanding of what we know about, I don't know, the solar system today. But still, for their own world, that made sense because it kind of comforted them. There's a moral dimension to this story that is very important to think of. That beliefs keep societies functioning, and this is something actually even that modern psychology actually tells us, that there is a need for humans to stick around certain ideas that are held as beliefs, but the way it's done, it's actually very, very flexible, right? It's sometimes difficult to discuss about these things because either, we have just these two perspectives, like the theistic and the atheistic one. But if you reason, comprehensively, you realize that, for example, every person has always had a different belief from another. Like, what are, find me two people who, read the Bible, for example, and that actually interpret it in the same exact identical way. There's never been, historically, even a single person that did this. And actually studying, I don't know, late antique history or early medieval history is quite meaningful in this sense, because it shows you how, aside from the Nicene Creed and naturally other beliefs that came to become standardized, but certain attitudes were still very different. There was still a lot of room for kind of expanding subtly and interpreting in certain ways and these ideas, and this was all intertwined with certain political visions and an understanding of the world, right, that goes beyond even the same theology, right? So it's somehow difficult to discuss this topics today, because I believe that, especially in certain parts of the Western world, there is a great sectarism and ideologization of these topics from every side, and this reflects, in my opinion, in fact, not even strictly religious problems, right? But the way how the certain cultures that were surely influenced by religion, but also had lots of other variables in this sense, because Christianity is one. It was supposed to be one, right? Instead, it didn't quite go in the same way. There are different confessions, there are different beliefs that are also, very fascinating, but that evolved, and this is what I want to say, from different contexts, right? They were at that point influenced by something else other than religion, if the Bible was still the Bible, right? Of course, for some peoples, maybe it was not. There were other interpretations of the same, what was canonic or not, even in terms of the Bible, and etc. But there is more than this. And in fact, talking about the history of Christianity and focusing so much on it, especially when we talk about these centuries of late antiquity and early medieval times, is somewhat misleading, or better. Of course, Christianity should be studied, and that's largely, also the way we can do it, even talking about religion strictly, because Christianity being a religion of the book, for example, and bringing a written culture in a world that in most of the cases actually still hadn't, meaning that, of course, we know that Rome was kind of had high levels of literacy, but we see it because we see, for example, firstly, the world of the city, forgetting that most Romans or Roman subjects, wherever you want to call them, actually lived in the countryside, for example, where beliefs, for example, didn't change very much over time. The agricultural the religions tied to the ancient, to the agricultural cycle, so there are things you can trace the continuity of since the Neolithic time into in fact, even, I don't know, the last century. There were of pagan, even in countries that were kind of fully Christian since millennia at this point. So this is the very interesting approach that we should take, not starting to study this world and its spirituality from like one day Christianity arrived and that therefore that changed everything, like whatever you think about it, for better or for good, for worse, excuse me. It sounded quite biased, to tell you the truth, but it was just a lapsus. But considering the fact that there were pre-existing beliefs, and that these beliefs also are largely, I think, misunderstood, misrepresented, and also in this sense kind of ideologically instrumentalized today. I must say I hold very skeptical views towards for example, the let's say the attitude. I don't want to put myself into a corner by talking in these terms, but let's say that there are many people, for example, have a genuine interest in paganism today, and the reason they have it, however, doesn't seem to me very very interested in the actual history of those worlds. Like, it's more like believing that there were people who believed in something and kind of emulating them. or kind of tributing some respect and memory to them, which is fine. I don't care. I don't have anything against these things. On the contrary, there are certain activities revolving around this that bring, for example, younger people closer in contact with these topics, right? But whether this actually widens broadly on a larger scale the awareness about history, or trying to correct the mistakes or the misunderstanding or the prejudices about that we own about ancient religions, as paganism as well as monotheisms, actually. Well, I'm not really sure about it, and I'm not very optimistic. I'm never optimistic, not even pessimistic either. But let's say I tend to. I think I've always been kind of fair in my judgments regarding certain things. I don't think that these are topics that have a great appeal, right? People don't talk much about them. And yet, I must confess, from my perspective, that I also got acquainted with them relatively late, right? Because if you're being rising in the West, I mean, you live essentially in a world that where you have been hearing about religion a lot, right? Either because you came from a religious family, or because you go out in this in the city center that's full of monumental churches that and there is a great intellectual activity that, of course, stemmed from religiosity, spirituality, and or its critique, and the whole history of the West is revolving essentially about what happened exactly in these points. There are moments in history between the late antiquity and the early Middle Ages that were crucial for our past, for our identity, for our culture, right? And when I arrived to these topics, I've always been enormously fascinated by them, because I realized that this happened largely at university. I must say, in high school, in school I never attended religious classes because you could opt not to do it. But in high school I wanted to do it. And it was an enormous disappointment, but not because of religion, because teachers sucked and they were stupid people, and there was no interest in, like, it couldn't be for other subjects, for example. But when I got to university and I started reading a simple manual of history of religions, well, that's where you get the kind of illuminated about the whole story. When you start to understand that religion is not a fairy tale for kids, nor it is something you have to take just dogmatically, and that it is actually an enormous field of anthropology in general, and that is at the base of so many of our understanding and beliefs and ideals and values that we still own. Like, you think this is valid actually even for secular values that are never actually quite secular as we think, because in fact what I was trying to say is that we have a generally distorted, kind of twisted view of even what the pre-Christian world actually was about, right? Many people actually buy the fact, I don't know, there was once upon a time the Roman Empire that was so secular and tolerant towards every belief that had reached these peaks of modernity. Then Christianity arrived and obscurantism fell, and everybody reversed back to ignorance. These are beliefs that were laughable, I think, in the same moment in which they were started being formulated. These are theories that in fact are outdated of almost 200 years. we obviously know that this was never reality as such, not for what concerns the alleged collapse of this enormous civilization of the ancient world, that who knows, they would have gotten on the moon or something. They would have started an industrial revolution, if it hadn't been essentially a cultural problem that changed everything and ruined everything and destroyed everything. No, it didn't happen like that. Not only, but it wasn't quite like that in the first place, which is not speaking bad of once again of Roman Empire. I have an enormous admiration and love and interest towards the Roman Empire, exactly because it was not this. Because it was essentially a religious empire. The same concept of empire is exclusively religious, which means that the only reason why there was a Roman Empire was actually religious. And this is not just about the Roman Empire, but it was actually about any other type of rule that existed at the time. Because guess what? Before theism, everybody was religious. What a surprise. And there were no exceptions into this. On the contrary, it was rather in the theistic world that, certain skeptical and even atheistic views kind of sparked at some point. I mean, atheistic meant as, lack of the idea of any deity, of any divinity that is not, strictly speaking, atheism, in the sense like even pagans were technically atheism in theistic terms. And by the way, always know that even the terms, in fact, this is tricky even terminologically, because we call certain stages of transformation, let's say, of religion as polytheism. Now, polytheism is actually a theistic world. For I don't know, the ancient Romans, or Greeks, or Celts, or Germans, or whatever, you don't need to call yourself a polytheist, because simply you've always had lots of gods. And another key of interpretation actually of the spread of Christianity is exactly the fact that to these peoples, actually Christianity, the Christian God, was just one of the many. So even the alleged repression of pagan cults and all this stuff should be actually framed into in a very different light, because actually Christianity in most parts of Europe actually spread very peacefully, in the sense that it was actually the same peoples living outside the control of Christian states that is essentially the Roman Empire, and for the especially during the migration era, they Christianized themselves by themselves. Like all the Germans, for example, that were entering at one point in contact with the Roman Empire, we know that had their elites formally Christianized, chiefly through Arianism, which was kind of a closer view, by certain interpretation of Christ was more similar to a hero rather than God. So and it was kind of inferior to the Father in part. So Arianism was it fitted more the pagan view of the world, etc. But this part of Christianity was something most of the times happening very spontaneously. And of course, our mind is polarized constantly about the fact that objectively there actually were, for sure, very violent ways in which Christianity was enforced on some communities, on some peoples, on some populations, that also were wiped out in the process. The other day we were talking about the Baltic Crusades, for example. But even in that case, you'll see, for example, that some of these pagans had even already Christianized and were, for example, taken out anyway. So you start seeing, and I think this is the broad message that in Schwerpunkt we spread, that is essentially, that it's not just about religion. Actually, religion is most of the times either an excuse to do something else, right? And this doesn't mean that it's worse, because if you need a pretext to do something, you do it. Like if you live in a theistic society, you will take it from a theistic point of view. If you live in an atheistic society, you would take it from an atheistic point of view. The problem is when I presume there is just a pro-theistic or an anti-theistic approach to history, which seems to be the matter in here. Like, you could be a theist or an atheist and studying history like as if it didn't matter. Of course, if you're a Christian, quite likely you will somewhat sympathize in general with the idea of Christianization because you think that it is something positive. If you're an atheist, probably you will think, you will not necessarily think negatively about that, but probably by certain standards you would presume that it would have been better without, or maybe you understand it in that moment, maybe it was a necessity, and that in other moments in history wasn't. These are all personal beliefs, and as such they should be dealt with. When you're a historian, you shouldn't really care more than much. Of course, we are all moved by certain interests, right? We don't study history because we are a random computer, we choose randomly a topic and we start studying it. We all have sympathies, we all start learning about things because we are interested in those specific ones. The problem is when history, in fact, is starting to be interpreted either in pro-theistic or anti-theistic ways. And it's very different. It's very difficult to distinguish them sometimes because that there is always some sort of intrinsic bias into people that will render things kind of complicated. But for example, you can see every time, for example, I share these videos about history of religion, there is always the tension or sense of malaise that derives from that's that you can perceive from some people. There are not a few that when you talk about religion, they're kind of not comfortable about it. And I think it would be the same where if, for example, I was talking about atheism as such, it would get people kind of also getting the same type of feeling. So and the reason of this is, in my opinion, in fact, not strictly religious. Religion lays there. You can start studying it. You can start reading about it. You can leave it there, whatever you like. But evidently, the fact that we still feel for it in these terms is still, in my opinion, the consequence of poor philosophical education, I presume, because it's easy to blame, as always. We often think, if that person hadn't done that and that, but we often don't realize that sometimes that maybe what happened was not even the problem. It's maybe our reaction to it that should make us realize certain things about the whole issue. So there can be different approaches for studying Christianity that, in my opinion, should be blurred a little bit. We should bring a bit more of anthropology and philosophy into the equation, right? Rather than, and also materialism or idealism, that's fine as well, as long as you cover 360 degrees this perspective, and you don't just enclose yourself into I belong to this group, whichever it is, therefore I will hate this other group, whichever it is, because it disagrees with me. But rather trying to understand, for example, why this happens, which I think is way more interesting than tearing each other apart and for no reason or no apparent reason. Of course, this doesn't mean that that people don't do bad things, like they didn't do it in the past, right? It's just that I think that it maybe doesn't belong to a single variable, and this is instead how sometimes we deal with history, which is seriously very unproductive and silly, right? Because this is not just about religion. This is about everything. You can't explain history just with dichotomies, with single interpretations, like as if other perspectives didn't matter, or they were just wrong because you're right and the others are wrong, and possibly you're good and the others are evil, and this stuff, right? And which is actually the best way to be morally consistent, because you see, if you think that everything is already kind of easy to determine, you've stopped to pursue what I think every single ideology in a way or in another, maybe not all of them actually, but at least the most sophisticated ones try to tell you, that is to be wise, essentially. That there is an enormous effort that we make in order to understand our world, because guess why? It's extremely complicated. So no wise person would always tell you, that reality is so easy and simple, right? And no philosophy does. And that's also why, even studying history of religion, you can understand that there were objectively certain philosophies that were kind of more, civilly consistent than others, right? You can't deny that there were certain cultures that were kind of more advanced by certain standards, and that they were in fact more civilized in a way or another, right? And you would say, and this also opens another question, which is what is civilized, and what is, do really more civilized peoples do better things? Well, actually, they don't seem to do, until you consider that what are the means and the ends. That is to say, it's not the tribal peoples that were annihilated, for example, by the Romans, that wiped out entire populations in the blink of an eye for extremely pragmatic reasons, were actually better people than the Romans that were killing them. Right, this is the same old story. Like, those people butcher each other daily, just did it on a smaller scale individually, but all together they weren't better than what the Romans were doing. They slaughtered children, women, old people. They sold slaves to the same Romans, and the Romans basically did the same. So at that point, what's the best option there? Who lived with cities with libraries, with aqueducts, with roads. Or who lived in villages in the mud, in the forests, and kind of went on travel. You can't say these were better or worse people, but you have to understand objectively how they contributed to certain things we do have today, because objectively civilization is a matter of learning, right? It's a matter of storing knowledge and awareness about the world we live in, so that you can cope with it more effectively, right? And nobody can deny that objectively we descend as a civilization from, what at the time were the largest civilizations. But it's not just that. I mean, other peoples, of course, left their mark, but at the same time, I think that the dichotomy, like Romans, barbarians, for example, is also quite wrong. That there wasn't a world, as we were saying before, that wasn't that was so enlightened, modern, and secular, and another was obscure and kind of ignorant and brutal. They both were in different ways, by different margins, not in the same way, but still by standards that today would seem morally reproachable. The same goes, I think, when you try to draw the difference between like the Christian world and paganism, that in case of European history is essentially saying that the Roman world and the barbarian world, as we were saying before, and certain different cultures that you can identify in the West, either with respectively like the Latin or the Germanic one, or in many ways also the Hellenic or the Slavic one, respectively, and that in this moment in history were quite mixed. We can't deny that. Certain peoples came together, that there was an osmotic process, but not a direct blending, right, of peoples that fundamentally had been also quite the same thing. And that's why the Romans, as we were saying before, were actually holding beliefs that and this is probably one of the greatest things I've tried to stress in Schwerpunkt, and I will keep making videos about this, that there was an enormous continuity between for example, the Roman imperial ideal, the Christian one, but also the pagan morals of the, I don't know, the northern tribesmen. I think this actually makes a lot of sense as an interpretation, because as I often say when we talk about, for example, the military, the values and ethics of chivalry and the origins of knighthood and the warrior culture, etc., I think we've got to recognize that the big power, the big empire, was conceived at the time, even by these, barbarians. When I say barbarians, I don't use it in the Hellenic sense. I use it in the Roman sense, meaning that, it's not the barbarians is a negative one. It's essentially saying everybody who kind of lived into this outer space, and especially in the non-civilized world that Rome had, in fact, not occupied, because Rome expanded, like all the great empires, in places that were already civilized. Right? They weren't stupid. Like, what do you do? What do you think that the Romans gave up invading Germany or Scotland or whatever? Because they couldn't conquer it. It's naive to hold such a belief. It's simply that it wasn't worth the pain, and guess why? Because they were kind of hells, respectively, and not quite very useful for supporting the types of structures of government and of administration and economy and demographic structure was the word necessary for making the civilized model work, right? So I don't know, some of you will hate me by this point, because I guess that I don't know actually what you like. I don't know what was the kind of the average follower at this point view on these issues, because but I know that even about this topic there is an enormous debate. Like, there are people who are kind of hardcore extremist, I don't know, Celtic fanboys who think that the Romans stole the entire civilization of the world that the Celts already had with skyscrapers and space shuttles, and the Roman Empire is just this terrible monster that reshaped all history, because we all know that history is written by the winners, which is also one of the greatest garbage statements that a person can do. History is not written by winners, it's written by historians, which is a different thing. And you find people who are just that radical and frankly dumb and ignorant and simply completely out of their minds in terms of historical awareness and actual macroscopical evidence by any standard, by any source, by any archaeologically speaking, so that but we have to be concrete about this. The word wars were actually people were civilized, who held certain beliefs, were kind of more evolved, advanced, whatever you want to call it. I don't know that there's not really an evolution, socially speaking. We can't speak of societies evolving as if we were talking about actual theory of evolution. Biologically speaking, societies do not work like just for you to know that. Never force those parallelisms, but actually people are very angry about this topic. There is a lot of effort, of concerted effort to kind of preserve certain, actually even preserve, to fabricate and preserve certain historical delusions that hide the fact that we all were barbarians at some point back in. If you make it a matter of your own ancestors, like there is not a single person here that wasn't a primitive barbarian who slaughtered other people for the glory deriving from it. We all passed through that. The Romans were civilized by kind of the Greeks. The Greeks were civilized by the Near East. The Near East was owed much to the Mesopotamian and Egyptian civilization. It all evolved like that, right? So there's nobody was intrinsically like the pure culture, the good culture. That is just garbage. Those are things that fortunately can't be said in normal places of learning, where if you go to university and you make certain statements, you're thrown out, fortunately and rightfully and justly, and that's why also how we leave this come out of certain places. But not that I ever had actual debates with these people, but I know that they do exist, like, I don't know, racial supremacists or other bullshit, and like, let's not digress so much, because I would like to maintain a certain level of, respectability in terminologically speaking. I'm trying to make a point in here, and the point is that objectively, Christianization during late antiquity and especially early Middle Ages went in parallel with the process of civilization, right? You can debate this for what concerns the Mediterranean, meaning places where objectively Christianity didn't arrive as a civilization but as a religion fundamentally. So the thing there's different. Here we're mostly talking about the fact that at one point the Roman Empire became Christian, and therefore it was like the most civilized place on earth, together with other, in China and other regions, a few other regions that were also civilizing in the same ways surrounding peoples. That in the case of Europe, in fact, were civilizing essentially, the Central and Northern Europe that were lagging behind, right? And also another, like, if you always know that the Middle Ages actually are this astonishing moment in which these areas of Europe that at the time were really like third world became in less than 1,000 years of medieval history and Christianization to be as advanced as Southern Europe, right? And just this perspective, you should make those skeptical people kind of reshaping their view about how even certain things work. What people actually lost with Christianization, we don't actually, in absolute terms, we don't really see it. Like, Christianization went in parallel, of course, with conquest in certain cases. Actually, most cases it didn't. It was mostly an elitary transformation that was progressively spread throughout all the rest of the social classes by osmosis, and that was, of course, imposed at one point, but let's not exaggerate about it. Especially in the countryside, people remained largely pagan up to very, 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 very late in time. And the reason being that the Christian elites simply wanted to have a shared, let's say they wanted to make the system function in an homogeneous way where the things worked. Like, if you held power and you were refusing Christianization, it wasn't about the religion in itself. It was about a different model of culture that was based on, for example, sedentary settlement, written culture, pacification, which are things that in tribal societies do not exist, right? They are fundamentally a mirage, which by the way, the same tribesmen had struggled to achieve. Like, the major, like, what were all those Germans roaming around during the migration era? They wanted to settle into a place where they could be wealthier. I mean, the ultimate goal of all these populations historically was to settle down at one point. This is what happened historically, right? And to settle down because they recognized there were places where they could rule, and being supported by the riches, the surplus of the land, and building something more structural. And it's obvious that the great resistance to such models was also due to the fact that sedentarization meant, in fact, the strengthening of the elites. Something about the freemen weren't very fond of, right? Because they would obviously with sedentarization there is a different partition of resources that doesn't stem just from the individual warriors' accomplishments in terms of loot and booty, etc., that is actually consumed by the clan of belonging, whatever. But it entails, more, fewer people getting more power, and of course subtracting freedom to certain individuals. But the paradox, the rest of, the freemen especially, but the paradox is that this is how our world emerged. Like, if today we have actually freedom and democracy and wealth and a longer and an enormously higher quality of life, life expectancy, wealth, etc., is because we passed through the structuration of those hierarchies. Like, there wasn't a moment in medieval Europe where hierarchies kind of went backwards at some point, like for which the society was kept under, like being a mass of tribesmen with no culture, no civilization. The Middle Ages is a constant construction of hierarchies that improved sensibly the wealth, the power of the countries that were ruled by them. And from this, all the rest of the population kind of largely benefiting them, right? You can say, well, this is maybe not true in certain instances where, for example, if you talk about the Ancien regime, of course you see the inherent problem with that at some point, but that happens because there are classes that became wealthier and it could kind of unhinge that system, but not really the whole system having been repressed in that sense. The emergence of those classes actually being the real proof that those hierarchies couldn't quite control the whole thing as they wished, because society was expanding no matter what. But in virtue of what they had done before, like by structuring that. So it's very controversial actually as a topic, and it goes in parallel, in my opinion, with many things we have observed about the losses, the sacrifice, the compromises that civilization entails. Civilization is not a progressive linear march towards happiness. It's really marked by some of the most horrifying events in human history that are, however, kind of concentrated as such, but that if we were to go back in time to see how it was before them, you would see they were kind of just scattered, like among like this differently distributed, and overall being kind of much worse comprehensively. Like, would you like to live like a tribal warrior, like spending your life in raids, in fighting, and having kind of a miserable life for the rest, if you were choosing kind of a more sedentary lifestyle, and suffering those same raids, and therefore having to cope with that anyway, and not knowing how well the world works and how to participate freely to certain political processes, just because maybe you were knocked out by your own oligarchy that anyhow conceived the idea that there was a general shared freedom, but the factor was ruling everything all along in your same place. Don't you prefer to live today, maybe where a lot of messed up things happen, but you kind of live decently after all? And that's actually what the whole topic here is about, right? These are questions that are very difficult to pose in the first place, because everybody can see that we think that freedom is the most essential good as such, but freedom is not largely, you can't be free even of killing someone. So you understand that you have to regulate your freedom in a way that sounds more like liberty, in fact, that is, that you're allowed to do certain things because you should be free, but also considering that there are other people who live around that should have those same basic rights respected. And this is something that up to the development of certain ideologies, well, it wasn't quite the case. Even in Saint Christianity actually stressed this. Christianity spreading the awareness, for example, of equality in front of God, of all human beings, in a world that was actually dominated by the ideal that if I am stronger than you, I have the right, the God-given right, to rule over you. Which was actually the real thing, because and that's what I was talking about before, actually, that there was a shared idea back in the day that victory came through the will of the gods, not through your accomplishments, and that was what was the way of the warrior actually was about. Christianity was bringing a different picture in the world. Like, it was saying, okay, yeah, the world is pretty messed up the way it is, but as parts of a universal empire that now is ruled by divine law, should ensure everybody the right of conscience, for example, of saying that you can, for example, have a different belief, even if, this is very important, even if Christianity persecuted those who went against certain beliefs, but they were still allowed, in a certain sense, to object the fact in itself. It wasn't a witch hunting in the sense that Christianization passed through, like, in putting people under Inquisition and like repressing them. That's something you find actually more during the modern age. Like, witch hunting, I don't know, was still alive in 17th to 18th century, even especially in Protestant countries, where even the Catholic Church by the 16th century considered ridiculous to burn a woman accused of witchery. Well, things went on largely also because in certain other countries there was a more tribal mindset remaining, and essentially reflecting that kind of primitive approach that had brought the clan, let's say, this, in fact, absolute freedom at the center of certain decisional process that instead had to be regulated in a civilized society. Now, this is quite important overall, because you would say, but even the Romans actually had the idea of the equality of mankind. Yeah, like if you study Seneca, for example, yeah, he was right in that, but he owned large, enormous latifundia where slaves broke their backs on the land every single day, and he surely didn't give a freaking damn about the fact that everybody was equal, because he most evidently, as a Roman senator, didn't give a damn about those slaves actually living in those conditions, and this was just like actually an evidence of something very interesting, that we can also be more civilized, but not necessarily making good use of our power, right? And this happens, however, because still there is a society that has not assimilated certain more than beliefs, certain systems of regulation, right? As we were saying at the beginning of the video, the same Roman Empire was actually largely private in nature. It was the major, there was still a very primitive, if you want, view of what also the whole moral sphere should be about. The Romans were quite primitive in this regard. They thought they were there to conquer the world, they were the chosen people of the gods that had wanted them to be victorious, and it was pretty much it. And there was a civilization behind this either that, as you know, in Schwerpunkt, we try to rediscover, because it's apparently and incredibly and shockingly removed from our system of values. It also draw from those beliefs and the idea of courage, of valor, of strength, etc. Many still of our beliefs today that are important, right? But at the same time, it was still a primitive world for our standards. We also have to understand that Christianity brought in a new concept that I don't know whether it's just an idealistic interpretation of history, but it's fundamentally inherent to the same promise, the same idea of redemption, of salvation, right? And in the revelation. So it's really all what the Christian message revolves around, that we are all equal in front of God if we accept what this it's difficult to actually to define the Christian message as such, because it's so ambiguous by certain standards that actually that's where its geniality stands and why it was so enormously successful, because actually it's prone to be interpreted in kind of different ways. Christianity never unbalances itself regarding to certain issues, like it operates on different levels. Even the same distinction between church and state, for example, it's not so evident, like because in the Bible there is in the Gospels specific, also in St. Paul's, there is this idea that objectively the state and the church are two separate things, that at least they pertain to two different dimensions and that should be considered as such. Now this is a very subtle ideal. You know, church and state were objectively separated since the beginning. I mean, the political sides couldn't be dissolved, of course, and there weren't objectively maybe so many differences from Roman time, from say pagan times, but the recognition that what, for example, is earthly, that there is a parallel, let's say, model of living in the heavens, and that let's say, parallel yet different in on earth, right? And there is a connection between the two things. For example, it's very deep, because it says it's always double. It's always double because it says that they are strictly connected, but they are on two levels that kind of cannot belong to one to another, if not in the vision of the creation. It's the same figure of Christ. For example, is Christ dead or alive on the cross? Have you ever wondered about this? But it's obviously both. That's the answer. Christianity has always this dichotomy, which reveals you and that urges you to always make an individual choice. This is probably the greatest, aside from the, let's say, the celebration of life and humanity and of beauty of life. Christianity always leaves you the space to make your own choice, and that commits you into it, right? So it's actually an empowering message. It's very far from certain interpretations that want Christianism just like, Christians like a herd of sheep that just obey, of sheep that obey to some, demagogue, like a priest or whatever, that tells them what to do. Christianity has never been like that. In the history of Christianity has always been actually a history of great struggle for the same biblical exegesis and of moral commitment. The Reformation stems from that. The whole, it's actually, the history of Christianity is that complex. We can't deal with it so simply. But where was this, for example, space for choice in a tribal society? because we assumed that tribesmen were free, and their paganism committed them into this world of absolute freedom, where everybody cultivated their own, happiness, and absolutely not. Tribal societies were radically regulated, and that's what the whole tribal society is about. You don't have a state, you don't have a higher ruler, someone that gives an order and a discipline and that rationalizes the world so that people can find the room for free activity, which is essentially the economical one that is needed by any single power that will have to do that, because otherwise the same power crumbles, especially in those times where still, how can you control people objectively? Where's that world? In the tribe, if you don't stick to that role and you don't fulfill it, you're out of society. I mean, that's literally that simple. If women go out of their traditional role, they're drowned in swamps. This is what we know they did. If men fled in front of the enemy in battle, they were dead in the eyes of their women, and they were out of society. And it was that strict, and the reason why it was that strict and actually so unflexible, and yet it corresponded to, for example, to those societies' needs, is that these societies were essentially weak. These societies were weak. They knew they could be wiped out by the neighbors in every single moment. So the whole social, political structure was regulated in a draconian way, so that could at least prevent, in part, that to happen, but in part, right? And that's the reason why during the migration era you have, for example, these tribes kind of putting themselves together and starting developing things like monarchies, and especially when they settle down into civilized countries, they start building kingdoms that is with a real territorial domination. That is what you can't do in a place like Germany or in the steppes or whatever. You can't even support a larger settlement than a village because you don't actually have the resources to accomplish that, right? So the myth of these peoples as brought under such a terrible, swallowing, oppressive civilization that subtracted them from their pure living free state it's a delusion. It's a historical delusion, and there are no ways to other ways of interpreting this anyway differently. I'm actually very convinced of this, and is there nothing negative about it? Of course, in relative terms, there are negative things about it, like entering into this more advanced societies implies that you can you can do certain things, but you also have to conform to what the broader rules are. Now the question is how good these rules are, and the idea is that if you compare them with how it would be like if those rules did not exist, well, you would start considering them more, not as a limitation to your absolute freedom, considered as an absolute value, like it was in the ancient world. Like, I can conquer you in absolute terms, and the only proof is whether I can succeed in it or not. And in case I do, in case I don't, I'm dead. But in the case I do, I can do whatever I want on you, right? Here, the whole thing is different, and it starts from the assumption that we are all human beings, that we are all equal, or better, we are equal in the sense that we all have an equal choice. This is probably one of the single most important things in absolute terms. Christianity doesn't tell you that Christians are all equal in the sense that everybody should be the same. We are all different. This is why the message is aimed at polarizing people to a common good, fundamentally, which is not saying be like the slave of this power. Christianity rebelled against statal impositions, for example. The word martyrology is about this, about the fact that, martyrs, the first age were objectively kind of religious fanatics, because they were so fanatic that the same Christians were telling them, like, just make that damn sacrifice that the Roman authorities ask you so that you don't die, like, and you don't leave a family, for example. These guys wouldn't listen to that. It would just be like themselves being butchered, and in this sense, the Romans did it, but also by asking them kind of multiple times. Like, it's not that the Romans started picking Christians and butchering them. What they were mostly interested in was this idea of cults, where there was this homogeneity, this conformity, for which the values, you see, also Rome, after all, shared kind of a civilized model in part. Like, the Roman Empire had a transformation in its own. The average Roman of the 3rd century BC was definitely not. It was kind of still half tribesman in its mindset. And if you talk about the 3rd century, the 2nd century, let's say, he was kind of an Hellenistic citizen, put it in that way. So what I'm trying to say here is that the process of Christianization, especially during the early Middle Ages, went largely in parallel with the construction of more sound powers in certain areas that had fundamentally never known them as, at least after the collapse of the Roman Empire, and that was also something lasted very long. It was a transformation taking place within the same Roman society. Many of you will say, oh, well, it was fault of the Christians. Well, no. And the reasons actually why the Christianity spread so fast is that there were serious problems in the empire as well. Christianity has this appeal for which it will make you think that there's going to be a better time, right? Even if that's theoretically projected towards afterlife, but in more realistic terms, people will accept it because they think that God will help them. And after all, as I often say, these people were all coming from a contractualistic background, mindset, typical of paganism, right? So you don't have to think that actual Christians, like in the 3rd century, 4th century, were like people who perfectly know the Bible, who were perfectly aware that it's all kind of a metaphor, an aspect that is more useful for well-being of with yourself and spirituality. It was like about, I want salvation, I want to be saved. That was the promise. That was a contract, right? And we do know that Christianity at that time was a hybrid with paganism. Paganism remaining there for centuries and centuries, right? Even millennia at some points. Do you think that, I don't know, knights in the 13th century in some of the most advanced places in Europe that were fully Christianized now actually believed, they actually believed in it, but do you think they actually understood Christianity as such? I always make the example of Jean de Joinville, some of the highest French knights in the service of Louis IX, the saint during the Crusades. Fully Christian, fanatically Christian, deeply Christian, that essentially believed that the only valid point for making a prayer was that God would actually make you win in battle, and otherwise why would you pray God for it? Literally written, right, in his work. So that makes you understand how even this process of Christianization was actually something very, very superficial in some ways, but also very deep in others, right? It was actually a great hybrid with pre-existing cultures and ethos and morals that lasted arguably up to now, right? There is always a contrast which is inherent to human mind between reason and instinct. Actually, even if I know there's a lot of people will say that Christianity is not reason. Well, actually it is. It is about the logos. It's about the science. It's about knowledge. It's about awareness. It's about the truth. It's about the idea that there is a truth out there, right? This is, even if behind any historical inquiry, we do know, unless we are moral relativists, which is, let me tell you, not a very good choice, that there is a truth. Now, the reality and truth are two different things, but there is a truth behind that, so that even if we can't understand what the hell is going on, even if we can't figure out what happened historically, we do know that something happened. And whatever that is meaningful, it's significant, it's important. Well, this is what Christianity is telling you. It's a broader philosophical perspective that tells you that it actually doesn't tell you anything. It doesn't tell you... even in all these eschatological perspectives, people have taken it often like a comic, like as a story of some kind, but these are all extremely radical, powerful, and violent metaphorical meanings that have to do with the general reality of existence, for the way we have to deal with it for real in our lives. And Christianity is this extremely acute philosophy telling you that you have to let go something if you want to accomplish something better, that there is always a way you can take by reasoning twice about something and not acting impulsively, by being overwhelmed by passions and throwing aside this divine use of reason and of conscience that we all can have and that we all have in our souls, in our hearts. This is the most powerful language of Christianity. It's giving to human life, to humanity as such. Think about the one of the pillars of Western civilization is represented by nativities, artistically speaking. In the West, we have this immense artistical production depicting what? Essentially two very poor people, the two refugees that are fleeing from persecution, that and the woman giving birth to a child in a disrupted hut, in a hell of a place in the desert that sucks, that is disgusting, but that by the same fact of having a mother, having a child, becomes the single most beautiful place in the world. This is the magnitude of the greatness of the hymn to good reason of humanity in a theology like the Christian one. And if one doesn't understand this message, you can't keep talking about it, and you will always fail to understand what the entire history of our world has been about. Because these are not exoteric beliefs or strange things some people own. This was literally what it was actually believed at the time. One of the few things, actually, these messages, this significations were the ones that were present everywhere, in every single church, in this art that you find everywhere, and this spread in these times. I mean, find a negative message in this, find a negative aspect in this message and let me know, because frankly, I don't know what to tell you. A religion that preaches love, that preaches equality, that rejoices of humanity, with a God that suffers together with mankind. Right? Find me another religion that deals with it in the same terms. This is not a matter of individual opinion. This is simply knowing something about history of religions, about anthropology, about history in general, of sociology. This is actual science behind it. So in insight, you can't see that Christianization of Europe passed through, even, of course, these were elites that were essentially trying to uniform populations to their own rule and legitimizing themselves with this aura of sacralization and of acquired right and self-legitimization, because whatever God puts on the throne, you have at least to mind of in a somewhat respectful fashion. But also whatever happens is also kind of God's will, so you can still overthrow maybe the evil guy, which is also present in the Bible as a concept. Even the killing of the evil guy is present in the Bible. So this is the depth of a thinking that even if, of course, such things existed in previous times, gave a somewhat more uniform and coherent and doctrinal structure to it, right? Because it's obvious that the children with the mother is, it's present, it's figuring, I don't know, even in Hellenic mythology, in the Hellenistic world, art, it's there. It was all there. Christianity took actually a freaking lot from things like, in fact, from many other religions, telling to many other philosophies, doctrine. We know it. Every person who studied history of Christianity knows which were the massive influences from Near Eastern culture, but also Asian ones. Christian monasticism having, monasticism wasn't invented by the Christians, but Christianity, let's say, being just one of the many salvific, let's say, religions spread among the aristocratic classes also, but also among the actually starting from the masses, but there were other, I'm talking about the Hellenistic world. Many of these religions were also exoteric in the measure in which they gnostically let you access to them only if you were a certain level of education, for example. Christianity had, as you know, a lot of Gnostic tendencies in some branches that are objectively not just. Like, why can't you be saved if you are, you're human no matter what, even if you're dumb and stupid? What Christianity says is that you can be redeemed, that no man is beyond redemption. This is also a very important thing. It's saying that after all, human life is infinitely valuable in potential. That you can, that the potential you can you own individually is always for doing something better. And from this stems some of the deepest roots of our Western civilization. Even in our juridical tradition, in our legal systems, they all stem from this, right? And not all, right? Of course, Roman law contributed decisively to certain of them. For example, the idea of the equality of the Roman citizenship was quite of a massive thing. It contributed for sure to spread this idea of equality in many ways, like that went beyond the clanic ethnical division and said, this is a universal empire, hence we can all become Romans, right? And Christianity, as you know, tributed an enormous, eventually actually, but still consistently, an enormous importance to the Roman Empire. Even this myth of the persecution, of course, some people were persecuted, but during the Roman Empire, in terms of their, not just Christians, by the way, because there were renowningly actually certain cults, certain pagan cults in the Roman Empire that were illegal, right? This is widely known to anybody who ever studied the history of Roman, law and religion, etc. Not everything could be believed in the Roman Empire. Actually, this is the great distinction, that there are cults that we exchange for like pure and brave people who dared to think independently. We were just actually a bunch of agitators and radicals and extremists and terrorists. Like, if you, for all the reasons that you want, but these things, I would like to say, exist still today. Like, I don't know, think about an occupied country. Think about what goal with the Romans. I mean, the Romans at a certain point started wiping out Druidic cults, because these were actively supporting anti-Roman resistance in Gaul from places like Britain, for example. At that point, you are the ruler of an empire. These people are creating problems because they are disrupting the economy, they're making assaults, they're causing turmoil, unrest. What do you do? And what is better actually for the local population, to live in a world where there is a permanent state of guerrilla, or kind of living in a pacified place? Think about the Near East today. Like, of course, people there, like in other places, kill each other because of political reasons or religious reasons, or whatever. But wouldn't it better for all of them at the end of the day, by their own same admission, to live in a world that at that point is pacified, that maybe, is still not completely fair, but at least ensures peace and stability? Because this is, I think, every person who lives in a war would like to see. And the idea, for example, of living in a universal empire where everybody is kind of, has the same rights and tries to live, to make a living there, and accept and just the fact of being namely Christian, for example. Because let's be honest about, we were saying about it before. It wasn't like a big deal to actually be formally Christian. Like, it hadn't been an enormous deal to be formally, to pay tribute to the imperial cults, actually, of Rome. They were pagan. Also, many Christians did it. Like, there is all the geography that developed later, and that kind of stressed, of course, this terrible persecutions and marches. But we do know that Christians were out there. They were everywhere. They were working like all the other people. They were kind of integrated. There was a discrimination against them, but they were still there, and they were spreading, and they were actually doing normal business. We know it from Christian literature. We know it from many things, from the same times. So even this harshness of religion before and after Christianization, it wasn't quite of a deal after all, right? And we do know that, and if you check that video I made on the sacralization of the Merovingian monarchy, for example, the idea is, you see that even though the elites, the monarchy was Christianized, was stressing Christianity from all sides, we do know that the large majority of the Franks that had still lost their freedom compared to pre-Merovingian times, and therefore were now submitted to the same monarchy, like, were largely pagan. And we're talking also about some elites, etc. So at that point, what do you think that Christianization actually meant for them? Like, was it imposed? Was there a violent moment in which these guys became Christian, and there were, there were persecutions, people burned, violences, oppression? Doesn't quite fit the picture. The same goes for Anglo-Saxon England. Was there some army actually enforcing Christianization? No, it was a very progressive, peaceful things. Even in Scandinavia, was there like a oppressive campaign, crusade to make people become Christian in Scandinavia? Doesn't seem so. What about Iceland, that Christianized in a couple of generations completely spontaneously, without bloodshed, without anything? Where was the oppression after all? Like, if it was there was indeed oppression by some standards, but there had always been in those worlds, and maybe Christianity as orthodoxy backed this kind of establishment. Of course it did, but was it the reason of that establishment? I don't think so. Nor it was the reason for actually actively oppressing people, because what does Christianity say in that regard? We can talk about corruption. Were not the previous worlds corrupted? How do you think the Roman Empire worked? How do you think even tribes actually worked? You think those were fair systems? They weren't. Like, was the medieval ones? No. But when is that we get kind of fair systems? Well, when we accomplished a certain level of wealth, where people started kind of fighting for their rights, because wealth had kind of spread, and therefore they kind of influenced the economy, and they could. And why did we get to that? Well, because we actually passed through the ancien regime, we passed through Christianization, we passed through things that kind of seemingly stabilized the world and allowed it to grow more orderly, more rationally oriented. Well, yeah. So what's the deal? I know it sounds, I mean, to many people, I realize that this sounds kind of strange talk, because it sounds as if I'm trying to convince someone. As you know, on Schwerpunkt, we don't try to convince really anyone, in the sense that, you know, if you agree or disagree, I don't really care. But I'm just saying these things because I believe they're anyhow meaningful from our point of view, whichever one it is, right? To get a more accurate depiction of what those times were. There are people indeed who interpret history just as a big oppressive clash, like between ideas, like as if there were constantly wars of religion, that even the whole I don't know, Christian-Muslim relation was exclusively about war, and it was the whole deal. I know people that they actually considered the whole history of the Middle Ages in terms like it was Christians versus Muslims, literally, right? I don't know if these people have ever descended into, I don't know, even normal stuff that can be found, like a political relations, economical relations, cultural relations. Do you realize how it was really? Because this obsession of putting religion at the center every, like, I was just reading it today, like in some groups about war, you know, will there ever be peace in places like the Near East, the Middle East? The question is, no, as long as there is religion around, right? And there are many people that have, actually, I think most of them are characterized by a markedly, I don't know, progressivistic, modernistic mindset, like the idea that there's this future that they will have to arrive where all beliefs will be, irrational beliefs will be erased, and we will all be pure machines that will reason by. And actually it's funny because these people, first of all, are reasoning by kind of, you know, aggressive standards. Like it's the same attitude of owning this belief that actually doesn't speak for much of tolerance that apparently they're claiming for, they're requesting for, and that they don't see in religion, right? And that actually the religion tells you that it's possible to have, right? Religions do consider the fact that there are other people who are not, you know, that do not believe, and you have to cope with, not necessarily with violence, and actually not with violence in most of the cases, and there is a massive misinterpretation of religions, I think, in general. At the point it's, we will have to make videos about this topic at one point. But especially, I think that we have a problem as Westerners with the recognition of these roots. We do have a problem, because in my opinion, and you know what's the real problem here? It's not cultural. Damn, I hate culturalism. I can't stand it, you know, because I study von Clausewitz, hence I can't stand culturalism. And for the mere reason, because the only way of accepting culturalism is fundamentally stating that there are cultures that are kind of immoral, which is to say that you know, there are evil guys and good guys, right? And if you belong to that culture, you're the good guy. If you belong to the other culture, you're evil, right? Well, it's it doesn't make sense. Humans actually tend to behave in similar ways when they're in similar situations, right? There's always going to be a difference because you can't eliminate these factors, these pre-existing conditions, but definitely to make the comparison fair. This is not also even saying that, of course, some cultures do not endorse things that are seriously messed up and therefore they should eliminate. But this is also saying that, in fact, every person can do something good about him or herself, regardless of his or her background, which is actually what I definitely stand for, and that makes a lot of sense. Now, the idea is, at this point, that the real problem, according to me, stands into what all essentially human problems derive from, that are the incapability of getting a kind of a concrete understanding or acceptance of the fact that doesn't matter how hard we try, we will always have a component of reason and a component of instinct. Actually, with instinct one being tendentially more prevalent, right? But the only way to acknowledge this is exercise reason that shows you that you can't do much about instinct, and that, however, you can kind of channel your force towards something more constructive that is rational. If you start interpreting history like this side was rational and good, and this other was kind of just instinct, even if we were talking about, in fact, two different societies, like more evolved, kind of more organized, and therefore that have definitely developed more intellectual skills, and a kind of a tribal society that relies on those kind of instinctual values and beliefs, you're essentially radicalizing the way you separate humans, and you describe your own same humanity. That is to say, I'm just rational. No, you're not. No person in the world is beyond, I don't know to say it in English, but cannot make wrong things. We all make wrong things all the time, and the important is acknowledging it and trying to make better instead of blaming someone else, even though sometimes you should when you see that is causing harm to other people. But that's exactly what the rational suits for. Like, it's making the best choice for solving the problem. There's something that with instinct you can't accomplish, but you also have to deal with, because instinct is always there, and it never abandons you, so you have to be aware of it, at least. So, I don't know where we're getting here now, but the core concept, in my opinion, is never be, let's say, so divided about entire things like entire cultures, for example, or civilizations, or beliefs in this case, like Christianity. Like, we're saying, whatever you think, but if you're a theist or an atheist, is either right or wrong, or either you're intrinsically right or wrong, right? Because this is how we tend to reason as well, right? That even if, if we hold a positive, let's say, if we have a prejudice towards theism or atheism, and we recognize that, of course, people who are of this type are good by certain standards, we still think that intrinsically these people are in a certain way, right? That's probably the mistake. That's the realization that we attribute to a tool the responsibility for something that is actually mental, right? A Bible or a Quran doesn't make you an extremist. As well, it doesn't make you a good person. your reason and your conscience make you a good person and make the difference between good and evil. So I do know that religious thinking is kind of more complex and that there are different takes on this story, because there are also religious people who actually say, you can't objectively be saved, for example. If, for example, Judaism has a different approach to this, because even in there's a huge debate, but for example, for a component of Judaism, technically you can be saved, even if you're not a Jew, for example, by essentially abiding, like behaving consistently with Jewish principles, right? Which is very fascinating, for example. And that's also why the history of Christianization in the early Middle Ages does have objectively a dark side, together with a bright one, because it also brought to a different form of discrimination that wasn't solved, if not the more we went on, but also stemming from the realization that it should be really a matter of conscience. That was, however, never denied. It probably was, especially in the 17th century, recognizing finally that you should be allowed the freedom of choice for what concerns your the confession, right? And what are your individual choices that do not involve necessarily other people. So it's that is very important, and you understand how easily here we can descend into philosophical matters, because all of this evolved from pre-existing thinking. Like, you can't exclude freedom of, like, tolerance, like it was built in the West, and it was created in the West during the 17th century, and thinking that pre-existing history, like Hellenic philosophies, Judeo-Christianity, have nothing to do with it, actually have an enormous deal to do with it. And Christianity actually was the one that managed, just like Judaism and Islam during the Middle Ages, in making coexist faith and reason. Because essentially you need both. If you are a true moral person, this is what was conceived at the time. You can't live just by thinking that you can feel about something. You also have to reason on. And this is, according to me, one of the greatest accomplishments of orthodoxy throughout all times in history. Like, throughout all times in history, the big, the great power has had to deal with problems that can't be solved just by letting people doing, like, alone, pretending that they will respond, like, to problems necessarily in a positive way. You do need to intervene at a certain point in limiting their freedom in order to ensure someone else's rights that naturally have to be recognized as equal rights, and something that is fairly equally shared on a legal level, and recognized also as a right, in fact, so that nobody can prevaricate someone else. Now, this is it never ends, because everybody, you will always find someone who will fight for this, because they will disagree and say, okay, no, I don't accept this. I want something else. I want my life to be in a different way than I want to be. And the easy way is saying, okay, I will fight against anyone who regulates me. And then not making everybody can do it. That's the warrior. That's what we sympathize also the most with, because we fundamentally recognize in it a sense of of purity, of spontaneity, of But that's actually not a thoughtful and reasonable position most of the time. Sometimes you have to make an effort to try to know more about why that regulation, for example, is being imposed on you, and you may still kind of not find fair, for example, the way it's enforced, or you can fight to change it, but you should be also aware that society needs that type of regulation, and yet that society is quite never right as well. Like you can't even be a fan of orthodoxy as a conscious. Like your conscience should always cry for a better world compared to the one it is, but always recognizing that certain things that already exist are there for a reason that may be greater than you think, right? And this is an important sociological and political realization, right? You can't do without it. You can't think you're just a victim, an oppressed person. You can't just think you're that you can always complain even about your life, because also great idealists are often people who do not care much about concreteness, about things that matter at some point more than ideals that definitely exist, right? And that definitely should help our life. I don't know if you get me at this point, but well, I think Christianization of Europe brought this ideal on the table, right? This choice was not contemplated before. Before, there was just the glory of the state conquering other peoples and kind of civilizing them, giving them an order, but still in this essentially military rhetoric. Christianity added something more. It added an individual conscience. The idea that the contact with the gods is not socially mediated as it happened in paganism. Because you think paganism was just like people freely believing their own gods. No, there were priests who controlled every single thing you did, not to overstep other people's rights, and you had essentially to stay to it. Like, you could believe all you wanted, but it was essentially a social contract, and you had to obey that, right? Christianity told us something that is paradoxically more, it's freer. It is essentially about the fact that no matter what happens around you, inside of your conscience, you are master of your own choice. You choose your own destiny. Right, even if, it's already decided, like in a omniscient idea of God, but it's still, and there. And there are, in fact, two different paths that, as a conclusion, that actually, with the Christianization of Europe happens, that there was an institutional, ecclesiastical way. It wasn't centered on the urban churches, for example, dominated by aristocracy and a priest, like a sacerdotal hierarchy, was rigidly structured, right? And around which were gathering citizens, and that promoted the evangelization of countryside around the baptismal churches, the parishes that depended on the bishop. Well, this way was also continuing on the wake of the ancient culture of the Hellenistic Roman aristocracies, right? The other one instead was, this was the collective one. Then there is an individual one instead. That is the monastic choice that was recovered in rapid moments to society through the organization, a common life into cenobian monasteries. So the monks were primary protagonists of the evangelization of the rural populations. They were far from the cities and the so-called barbarians, right? And they were promoters of a social, cultural, economical organization alternative to the one emanated by the cities. So you've been finding here that even in the missionary activity and the activity of catechesis, you have to take into account the process of an acculturation, a sort of deep and reciprocal integration between new ethnicities that were settling in the European territory and the population that traditionally had resided in there. And the religious language mediated this common values, right, in a universe that had already contained them in part from different directions. Even the sacralization of the monarchy, etc. It wasn't just Christian, it wasn't just Jewish, right? It came from the Germanic world as well. This idea of magic powers, this idea of a supernatural that intervenes in life. You can't think of Christianization like just by detaching the two things, like pretending that they were separated, that the pagan ethos was essentially one, and the Christian one was another, right? As you can think that even the same paganism that came in contact with Christianity was impermeable to it, because it wasn't, and that's the reason why Christianity spread, because it was autonomous, it was not enforced, right? So even the perspective of a forced Christianization doesn't take into consideration that Christians were the ones persecuted at the beginning. So Christianity spread anyway, and why, according to you? It fitted broadly also with certain requests. So the poor masses of this inherited of a pagan world at that point, whose aristocracies had grown largely kind of too elitistic, too undetached with reality. Paradoxically, the Germanic model brought closer to the idea of individual freedom. There was and the promise of a new land that Christianity was essentially making people expect in a certain way. So there were certain meeting grounds actually between different cultures, apparently, and we try to depict as so different from each other, that actually weren't that different at all. And also this continuous dialectic between sacerdotal classes and monasticism, this continuous choice that was offered by the Christian civilization on the base of what kind of direction you wanted to take, which kind of choice in a world that I repeat to you that here there's no central empire anymore. The early Middle Ages, it's different. It's all much more fluid. People are free largely to do what they want. Paganism remains actually for a long time there, as we've seen. So this impression of Christianity is not so incisive as we think. It was a clash between elites most of the times. The common people didn't really see much of a change, and it would be interesting even to get the perspective of those who considering the fact that Christianization was also a clash against other elites, and that possibly even the average commoner, so the freeman, so with Christianity as an enticing, like a promising, seductive idea, after all, in front of the same hierarchies of that pagan world that we're trying to monopolize. So those who actually adopted Christianity eventually, of course, tended to stratify society further, but at the moment of contact, even thinking about what it means to enter into the Christian world economically, culturally, this idea of writing, this idea people knew Christianity requires being literate, at least by certain standards. However, expands this use of the written word into a more, like, it was coming from a word where albeit it was linked to the Bible and therefore had its sacral value. The act of writing wasn't sacral anymore. Everybody could do it. Everybody could read. Right? It wasn't monopolized by the priests, the pagan priests that were essentially jealously preserving all of this knowledge that in part went lost because there were classes within these societies that were deputed to preserve it, and the other people had to do essentially something else, right? So it's all very, very shaded. It's not that easy, and we do know, in fact, that many people actually chose actively to convert to Christianity before the elites told them to do. There are many sagas actually that document this, that show the evidence of dissatisfaction with certain ways the world was ruled in those same societies, where it was essentially a contractual thing. It was not about you having actual rights, but having the strength to fight for them, which of course was important from one side, but also if you didn't have the strength, you were done for. Someone more powerful would come there, and you had simply had to accept it, because it was even how it was conceived at the time. And of course those people would fight back, as they would fight back when they were, I don't know, like in the case of Saxony, they were invaded by a Christian power like the Franks. But again, also in their religion was a tool for controlling society, but controlling it also in a positive sense, and at the same time being just a tool in the hands of someone who made choices that were dictated by other reasons. You can't understand why the Franks invaded Saxony if you don't realize the centuries of continuous warfare along the frontiers, with continuous Saxon raids into the Rhine Valley, etc. Who was the evil guy at that point? But we all cried because the Saxons get destroyed. Those terrible Franks imposing their religion. Well, I think those guys who were trading and working in the Rhineland that was raided by the Saxons also maybe didn't deserve to be raided and killed by the Saxons. So was the evil guy here? Right? They were from both sides, and that's why religion is not a discriminant in this sense, and that you can weaponize it whatever you like, just if you have the power, the pregressed power of doing it. So I think this is the main idea behind this video, and realizing the intrinsic difficulties we have also in addressing still today such topics without kind of becoming polarized around a dichotomy. We can't be like that, right? Because history tells us otherwise, and it's kind of convenient to listen to it. Alright, so for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like, or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.